jump into Luke chapter 21. So join us there. And if you don't have a Bible, please, raise your hand and we'll get you one right away. We want to make sure everybody has a Bible that they can follow along in the Word of God. So Luke 21 is where we left off. We actually took the first couple of verses of Luke 21 in our last message when we were together in Luke chapter 20. The first few verses about the widow and the rich casting their offerings really went very good with the previous story. So we pick up today in Luke 21 verse 5. Just remember the scenery. It's really important to remember the kind of the timing of all this. If somebody is on their deathbed, they may say different things to you than when you first meet them, right? And so I'm trying to make it a stretch there to get the point across. Jesus is really at that end where he knows there's only a few days left. And in a way, he's saying things that are even much more to the point than he would have even before. So in Luke 21, there's a discussion of what's going to happen in the future that comes up. And I want you to kind of remember the scenery so you can remember kind of his heart behind maybe the way he's saying these things to them. He has entered a few days before this, a few chapters before this, he's entered Jerusalem as the prophesied Lamb of God to be examined for 4 days. Because the Passover day that he will be crucified on, coming up in 2 days, is the first month, 14th day of the month of the Jewish calendar. Well, he came into Jerusalem on the first month, 10th day of the month. And he's there for these 4 days to be examined of the people. And he will be showing his perfection in front of them this whole time. But additional to being examined by the skeptics in Jerusalem every day, I just want you to remember his pattern this whole week long. Is that he goes into the temple and the crowds are ready for him. By day 2, the crowds are like, I know he's coming in the morning, and the crowds gather. But then each night he resorts out of town. He travels back down the hill out of Jerusalem and then back up the Mount of Olives, right across the valley of Kidron, the Kidron Valley. Goes back up the Mount of Olives, and he stays in the little village of Bethany with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So this is his pattern all week long, where he's going and he's staying with them just outside of town. I mean, it's the geography is a little different than here because he leaves Jerusalem, goes through the Kidron Valley, goes back up the Mount of Olives, and he's basically in Bethany. I mean, it's sort of like how we might relate like Green Village or Scotland to Chambersburg. It's just right there, sort of, but it's a whole separate place. I mean, like the Chambersburg Mall was in Scotland, all these years, right? It's not there anymore, but it seems like Chambersburg, but it's got kind of its own identity, and that's sort of how these surrounding villages were, like Bethany. Yeah, it kind of had its own identity as Bethany, but it's really just one of those villages on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and that's where Mary and Martha and Lazarus live. But just so neat that he had that comfort, every night, and it's a neat balance because in ministry there's always that need of when you're involved for the Lord, you have those times where it's service, it's life, it's giving, it can be hard even, but then God will always give you those refreshments, the time just to come back to church and sit and enjoy, take it in, and the Lord had that. He modeled that for us. So just remember that even in our own ministry, that there's a life of ministry, but always have those times where you can come and you can be refreshed with the Lord and with friends. Have all of that. And he certainly had that. So Luke 21, it gives us a part of what's called the Olivet Discourse. Matthew's gospel, Mark's gospel, they really give a much more fuller version of the events of what happens in this encounter, where the disciples are going to bring up the temple and say, oh, look how great this temple is. And Christ is going to launch from that into the temple being destroyed and what's going to come in the future. And so Luke gives us a part of that account. And so the full version of this is called the Olivet Discourse. Just recognize that Luke gives us a part of that discourse or a part of that message that the Lord gave. And so you can get even more parts of this account throughout Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and other places. Matthew and Mark even go the whole way into the future, into the tribulation. Luke just barely touches on the very end when Christ comes back at his second coming. So we're going to get into those things today. But the point is, Jesus wants them, these disciples, and us to be prepared for the future. I think we were just talking in a small group this morning about how the Lord says that we're not just his servants, but we're his friends because we know his business. He's invested in us. He's told us things of his nature and his mission and his purpose. And, when you share your hopes and dreams with somebody, that's a way of becoming deeper friends with them, right? I don't remember the way Melvin put it this morning. It was pretty good the way he put it too. But that idea of investing in another person. And so as he, at this end of his life, starts to go through these future events, he's preparing them. It should be a great comfort to them and to us to know Christ didn't, it's one thing for him to come and die on the cross, but it's another thing for him to say, listen, I want to explain this to you. I want to tell you about this. I want you to know what's going on. And by way of preparing us. And that should just be such a love, it's a love letter to not just do something for you, but to tell you, right? I mean, it's sort of like somebody, you're struggling to build a trinket or do a thing, and you've had the person that has come over and say, get out of the way, let me do it, right? Versus the person that comes over and says, oh, let me help you with that. And they get right involved and they do it with you. And I kind of see that's Christ's perspective. He didn't just come and say, oh, get out of the way, let me die on the cross for you. But he came and he said, let me show you what I'm doing. Not that we're going to help him with it, but that he's investing in explaining it to us and talking us through it. And I just want you to see that heart as he begins to explain these future events to them. That he has this heavy burden about what's about to happen to him in going to the cross. Tomorrow, the very next day, he's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane, agonizing over his will to whether he's going to do this. And that's where he's at in mind and body and spirit. He's agonizing with these deep thoughts. And yet he takes the time to explain all of this to them in this chapter. I don't know about you, but I can get so focused on a task that somebody comes up and asks me something different, and I'm just like, yeah, I'll get to you in a second, and I'm just right there. He's not like that. He's so focused on the mission set before him, and yet his disciples come and they ask him questions, and he's like, okay, yeah, come over here, let me explain it to you, and he's doing it all. And I just think that's so much not like me. I want to be more like that. And so he's leaving, and he's getting ready to depart, and yet he takes them under his wing. The title of the message is Living in Light of Jesus' Departure, and he's prepared us for this moment. So we're going to see some actions that we can take to live in light of his departure, that he is gone from us right now. We pick it up in verse 5 of chapter 21. That's where we left off. Those first few verses were when he had first come into the temple that day, and he saw them casting in their money, and now he's leaving to go back out for the night, starting in verse 5. So the first one I want to point out to you, the first way we can live in light of the fact that he has departed to heaven, is to focus on Christ himself and not just on religious materialism. I want to develop that over these next couple of verses, but can you understand the difference between doing a religious thing because it's for Jesus versus doing a religious thing for the material value of it or for the material gain of it? Those that would come to because they want to grow the building versus grow the people, right? These types of things. This is what I want to develop. I think that's what the Lord is telling us in these first few verses. So take a look at this starting in verse 5. And as some spoke about the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said to them, and we'll get to verse 6 in just a second. So the premise here is that they're leaving for the night, and they're like, Jesus, this temple that Solomon built, right? And then that temple was destroyed. It was rebuilt under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And then in the 100 of years before what we're reading right now, King Herod actually refurbished that second temple, and that's what they're looking at. This King Herod refurbished post-exilic temple, if any of that makes sense to you. It's the second temple. And they're looking at the glories of this temple with its gold and jewels and all this. And they ask Jesus about it. And they say, it's a pretty awesome symbol of what's happening here in Jerusalem, right? In fact, you can, if you've never read Josephus, there's a Jewish Roman historian, Flavius Josephus. He goes by his Jewish name, Josephus. I have a joke about that, I must tell. When the kids were little one time, something happened where I think it was a bee or a fly or something was flying around. The volume of this Josephus book I have, he's got two major works. Kara's already laughing, she knows this one. Josephus wrote Wars of the Jews and Antiquities of the Jews, two big books. He wrote some other ones as well, and I've got this giant hardback volume of those two major works of his at the house. And so something was flying around, and whack! All of a sudden the smash comes, and one of the kids says, "Mom, did you get it?" And she goes, "No, it was Josephus." So she was very excited about that. So we always remember that now, that's exactly the book that took out that hideous animal, whatever it was. But Josephus, he wrote these books. In Wars of the Jews, he talks about in great description of the temple and the glories of the gold. They built it in such a way that it opened towards the east, towards the sunrise, covered with gold. When you're walking to the temple towards it, towards the front of it, towards the east, in the morning, and the sun gleaming off of it, you couldn't even see it. They talked about how visitors from as far away as Babylon could look at it, and they saw it as a light in the distance because of the sun reflecting off of all that gold. That's how glorious it was. And this is the rebuilt temple. That wasn't even Solomon's original temple. So just a glorious sight. And so when they bring up to Jesus, "Hey, what about this temple? Pretty nice temple that we have." It is a glorious sight. And yet watch his response here in verse 6. He says, "As for these things which you beheld, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Wow. Remember, this is the last time during his first coming that he's going to be there at the temple. He's going to go back in the next day, and that's it. He's done being there. And there's a certain sadness in his heart that there's so many here. Remember, it's the holiday season. There's people from all over the land and all over the country that have traveled there for the holidays, for the festivals. People everywhere, jamming the city. And so many could be excited for what the holiday represented. And part of Christ's experience is this sadness that there's so many of them that are there that have not accepted the message. They haven't accepted that he is the fulfillment of what the very holiday is supposed to be for. And part of his answer here, talk about a wet blanket, right? Look at this glorious temple. And he's like, yeah, it's going to be thrown down. Oh. But he's intentionally trying to adjust their focus from saying, look, don't put your hope in these things. You think this is going to endure forever? What are you thinking here, guys? That this temple is going to be your savior? It's going to be something that you can constantly just run into and hide? What are you thinking? So he's needing to adjust their understanding of this. Don't put your hope in anything of this world. Can you name something that won't burn eventually? Right? Even this temple. And literally the Romans will come under General Titus. At the time he's general. He will later become emperor because of this. Titus will come and he will destroy this temple. In 70 AD, only a few short 35, 40 years after this, he will come with the Roman legions and destroy this whole area and the temple and wipe it out. And the fulfillment of exactly what Christ is saying is going to happen. He literally said there in verse 6, not one stone would be left upon another. That's not just burning your city down. Unfortunately, we've seen some things burned down lately, haven't we? I think of Maui and some other places. And you see some of the aerial footage, and not everything is to the ground, right? But his prophecy is not one stone will be left upon another. Well, what? Like, how could that be? Well, again, there was so much gold in the temple. You can read in Josephus and other places that the Romans, after they burnt down the city, then they came in and they literally dissected it to get all the gold out. They weren't going to leave the gold behind. So they literally kept dissecting more after the fires to get all the gold, to fulfill exactly his words here, that not one stone would be left upon another. Literal fulfillment. Now, there's something really super interesting that you need to keep in mind when you're reading Luke 21 and then even the fuller account in Matthew 24. If this verse, this starting point of his future telling for this chapter happened exactly like he said it would, to the T, not one stone left upon another. If that verse was literally fulfilled of his words, then you can trust the entire chapter that we're about to read is meant to be interpreted in that same way, right? This verse, his starting point for talking about the future, was literally fulfilled. That's exactly how he intends for us to interpret the rest of the chapter. You in agreement with that? Pretty good? Because that's important as we read the rest of this chapter. And you're going to see some fanciful things in the rest of the chapter. And you're like, how's that going to happen? I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen. So isn't it amazing, though, in the midst of his agony of going to the cross, he takes the time to comfort them about the things that are coming in the future. Wow. You know, guys, we still have this book today, while he's gone, to pick this up and analyze the things that he has for us for the future, for now and for tomorrow and for the next day, and while we wait for him to come back. So don't put our hopes in anything material, but put our hope in Jesus himself, the one that will be coming back. Let's go to verse 7 here. They asked him, saying, Master, when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? Their words, their questions here are much fuller in the Matthew and the other accounts of this. Not only are they asking when they say when will these things be, that's directly related to when will the temple be destroyed, right? But also they asked here, what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? What's the conditions going to be like leading up to this? But you can see that they also asked other questions like, what will be the sign of your coming? They're tying together in their questions of verse 7, the destruction of the temple ties together with his coming back. And so in his answer, he will give a wide-ranging answer. He starts with answering in this chapter about the temple being destroyed and the conditions leading up to that. But then he broadens the whole way out to his second coming, because that was part of their questions from verse 7 that you can see even more in the other accounts. But I love the fact that do you have a red letter Bible, right? Do you know what that means? That means the red letters is the words Jesus spoke. I love the fact that they asked these questions in verse 7, black, because it's the disciples writing this. And then we've got all these red letters coming up. He's going to answer their questions in a big way. And I just love that. In the parable of the sower and the seed, when Jesus gave the parable, this earthly example of heavenly principles, he gave the parable of the sower and the seed, and then at the end of the analogy, just the analogy part, not the interpretation, just the analogy, he said, to him who has ears to hear, let him hear. Like, bye-bye. See ya. And some of the disciples came back to him at that time in Matthew 13, and they said, wait a second, no, I didn't get that. That parable you told, I don't understand it. And his response was, to him who has ears to hear, let him hear the things that the Spirit says. To you it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God. And he then goes into it, and he gives them the the interpretation of that parable of the sower and the seed. And I love the fact that he gives the answer. They ask questions and he gives the answers. That principle still stands today. Many of us have questions. Lord, what's going to happen to me? Lord, what should I do next? Lord, how should I, to him, if you ask, he will answer. He doesn't always answer at the time frames we want, but he will answer these things. He delights to answer our questions. So please continue to ask, and you'll get all these red letters. It's just a question of when. So they ask, and now his response begins to come in verse 8. In verse 8. Take heed, he says, take heed that you be not deceived. For many people shall come in my name, saying that I am the Christ. And the time draweth near, go ye not therefore after them. So the first sign that he gives of future, let's say demonic activity, let's say activity of the enemy, things that are going to happen against him, some of the signs of the times is that before Christ actually comes back, because that is part of one of their questions, before he actually comes back, there will be many people that will say that they are, and the word here is in italics, Christ. People will come saying that they are him in one fashion or another. Now, look, in the last 100 years, there has been an explosion of this. In Middle Ages, in Reformation days, you had many people that would come and they would say, I'm your new teacher. But in the last 100 years, we've had an explosion of people that have come on the scene and said, I am Jesus. Or they've come and they've said, I am the Christ. Maybe they don't say I'm Jesus of Nazareth, but they'll say, I am the Christ of God. Or have you heard this one in the last 20 years? I am the Christ consciousness, right? That I have the Christ consciousness. This is exactly what he's talking about. People will come and they'll say, I have the Christ, or I am the Christ. And he's warning us. He's saying, no, that's going to happen. People will come and they will try to imitate me. And don't fall for it. That's his punchline with this. Don't fall for it. The time draws near. Go ye not therefore after them, in verse 8. So beware, be aware that it's going to happen, and be aware to not follow them. There was a guy in Australia that was just on Fox News the other day saying that he is Jesus of Nazareth. And his name's like Alan Smith or something, but that's who he says he is now. And of course, what do they come with? They come with a new message. It's always a new message. And you dig into it further and you find out that it's for their own gain. It's always for their own gain. None of these guys are dirt poor living in a hut, okay? They all are doing it for their own gain and for their own reputation. In fact, look up 2 Peter chapter 2 on that. And 2 Peter reminds us in his second letter, chapter 2, how all of these false teachers that come, they are doing it for their own covetousness, for their own gain. And so it's a telltale sign to watch for their own prosperity. I don't think there's any minister of the gospel that should ever live a lifestyle higher than the people around them. Ever. The word is minister. The word is servant, right? I'm a minister of the gospel and you're going to live a lifestyle 5 times better than everybody around you? That doesn't make any sense, right? And that's what these false prophets and false Christs will do. It's all for their own gain. 2 Peter lays that out more. But why would people receive somebody that comes and says, I am Jesus or I am the Christ? Why would anybody fall for that? Well, you have to do something first before you would actually receive a false Christ. And Paul tells the Thessalonians exactly what it is. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. With all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because, and here's the key, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause, God will send them a strong delusion, that they should believe a lie. The way you end up falling for counterfeits is because you've first examined the authentic Christ and you've said, no, I don't want to put myself under the authority of Christ. I want to do my own thing. And then when somebody else comes along that looks comfortable to you, you're more than willing to let them be your Christ. Because they're not going to hold you accountable. And they're not going to dictate anything. They're just going to tell you that Christ is love and whatever. And it's all fluffy. It's all fluffy. And so this is exactly why. It's only when that you reject the truth that you would fall for somebody like this. Some fall for the, Jim Jones in the 70s. I'm sure some of you have heard of that whole situation. Not every one of them were, years and years and years invested in that. Some of them were really new. And that is the side effect of these cults and these false prophets and these false Christs that you need to watch out for. Some people simply fall for these people because they don't know any better. Now, let me ask you, if anybody's ever dealt with money, nobody deals with money anymore, it's all plastic, but if you've ever dealt with money in a bank, how can you tell a counterfeit bill? Because you're trained on the real ones. That's how you know the fake ones. You're trained with the real ones. And the more you touch and handle the real ones, you know exactly what they're like. Oh, a new bill came out from the Treasury, and they've got signs everywhere, and we want you to know what they're like, and we want you to feel them and touch them and crease them and hold them to the light and x-ray them and do whatever, But you get to know the real one. And the more you know the real one, when a fake one comes along, the moment you pick it up and you're like, wait a second, and just the feel of it, you're like, this isn't right. And it should be the same way. We're in church and we're fellowship and we're learning Him and we're touching here's the $10 bill and there's the $20 bill and we're touching them all. And then all of a sudden somebody says something to you like, well, I'm the Christ consciousness and I have a new message for you. And you're like, wait a second, that's a counterfeit. So just get to know the real one. And when the false ones comes along, you will see them. You will see them. Before we go to verse 9, though, he said there, as he opens this message in verse 8, there was a little phrase I want to make sure I don't miss. He's talking about, hey, look, as time goes on, don't be deceived by fake news. But there's a message he says in that verse 8. He says, some will come saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Don't go after them. Time draweth near. He's already indicating that as he goes down through his answer here, there's a period of time. There's an extension to this. It's not just like the temple's getting destroyed tomorrow and I'm coming back in 2 days. There's a period of time involved, and he's already wanting to make that clear. That his next words in red here are not all going to happen tomorrow. There's quite a period of time that he's trying to draw out, and he needed to say that because look, these disciples at this point, 3 years walking with him, they're in their mind, they're like, let's get this show on the road. Like, what are we waiting for? I'm ready to overthrow Rome, and he has to get this point continually across to them. Like, there's a time element here. Can anybody relate to that? Where you're like, Lord, can we just get this show on the road? Like, I got business I want to do. Let's move. And the Lord's like, there's time involved. We got to be patient. So we go to verse 9 here. We go to verse 9. But when you shall hear of wars and commotions, you might have the expression rumors of wars, be not terrified. For these things must first come to pass. But the end is not yet, or the end is not by and by. Then he said to them in verse 10, nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes. Great earthquakes shall be in diverse places or different places, and famines, pestilence, fearful signs, and great signs shall there be from heaven. In Matthew's account of this, Matthew calls these things that we just read the beginning of sorrows. So as we get towards the 7-year tribulation, the 7-year tribulation, it is a time period where God's attention is back on Israel. But even before getting to that 7-year tribulation, there are sorrows that come upon the earth as we lead towards those days. The expression that Matthew uses, the beginning of sorrows, to describe these things here from verse 9, 10, and 11, it's a medical term. I'm surprised Dr. Luke didn't use it here in this one. But it's a medical term that really means an expectant mother's labor pains. It's the beginning of sorrows, the expression of a pregnant woman. And what is he indicating here by saying the beginning of sorrows? That they will grow in intensity and in frequency. So as you look at these signs from verse 9, 10, and 11, all of these troubles, these sorrows, are like the earth itself ready to give birth, saying, I'm done with this. Let's get this out of here. Remember we talked a few weeks ago about the Pharisees, when Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, the Pharisees said, tell your disciples to stop shouting hallelujah. And he's like, if I told them to stop, even the rocks would cry out. You know, it's like the creation is longing to give birth and get done with this. And that's the expression that he uses here of all of these signs in verse 9, 10, and 11. They will continue as we go towards the end to grow in intensity and frequency. Well, let's look at some of these real quick here in these verses. Verse 9, wars and what do you have in your translation? Commotions, threats of war, rumors of war in some translations. But the idea is that there'll not just be wars happening, live and in reality, but the threat of war also. No age has experienced not war, but the threat of war more than our age. We live in a society where at any moment somebody could pull the trigger. Somebody could launch the missile. You know, that didn't happen 200 years ago, 500 years ago. You didn't have this scenario where at any moment something could change on a cataclysmic scale. We're living in the nuclear age now, where whether it's chemical, biological, or nuclear, something could happen dramatic in a moment. Now, I'm not saying that to scare you. We're saying that to prepare you. That the Lord said these things will grow in intensity. This fear of war. Not that there will be, every soul, lost. We know that that's not going to happen because we read Revelation and we see that. But this threat of war, my point is, no generation could say that they've experienced the threat of war more than, when did the atom get split? Just in the last 100 years. So we're living in this day and age where not just wars, but the threat of war is happening at all times. But you see what he says in verse 9 there? After wars and commotions, be not terrified. Be not terrified. He's preparing us. He's giving us this information not to make us fearful, but to prepare us for what's coming. And the more we're prepared, the more we'll have the hope living within us. Well, he goes to the next one and he says in verse 10, nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. That actually is two different things. I hate to get a little geeky, Greeky on you here, but nation and kingdom are different. Nation is the word ethnos, or what is that? Ethnic group. Okay? So he's saying there will be ethnic group against ethnic group, but then kingdom against kingdom. That is Basilia versus Basilia. This is country against country. And we see all of that, right? We see that there are nations against nations, but there's also ethnic groups against another ethnic group within America. But we also see, even particularly in the Middle East and in Europe, you have different ethnic groups, not necessarily per country, coming against other ethnic groups. So both of these things are very clearly happening. And then the next one listed is earthquakes in diverse places. A few years ago, I went ahead and I said to myself, I want to know for sure. I want to do the math because I'm a little bit like that. Sometimes I just want to do the math. I sketch things out. I graph things out. And I did the math on earthquakes. I went to the U.S. Geological Survey and I said, I want to know if earthquakes are literally increasing in intensity and frequency. And the one thing that you can't do is you can't go to some database and just look at every earthquake. Because it is true that science has gotten better to the extent that we used to be able to only detect certain earthquakes. Well, now we've got a lot more detection equipment. We've got a lot more precise detection equipment. So if you just looked at sheer number of earthquakes from the year 1900 and the sheer number of earthquakes from today, of course there's going to be more today because we have a lot more ability to detect. So you say to yourself, okay, well, what is a valid way that I can compare how many earthquakes were happening in 1900 versus how many are happening today. Well, the Richter scale hasn't changed. A 6.0 back then is still the same as a 6.0 today. Same thing. So you can compare that data. So we did that. I don't know if I have the date on here or not, but this was maybe 15 years ago or so. I don't know, maybe, no. Oh no, this is my updated one, my bad. This is through the 2010s. So this chart completes the decade of the 2010s. And the idea of this chart is to graph just the 6.0 and graders through the decade. You can look up, take a picture of the reference, you can go look it up for yourself, because the larger the room, the more there'll be a skeptic in the room, but there's your reference right there. And notice, per decade, there was 44 6.0 earthquakes worldwide in the 1900 decade. In the 1910s, there was 132, and so forth. And you can continue to go through this and get some pretty interesting data. But one of the things that's interesting is right about here is when the Zionist movement started. David Ben-Gurion was alive, and he was stirring up the people to try to get a Jewish movement to go back to that nation that was called Israel, that was just a part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. This Jewish man, David Ben-Gurion, stood up and said, I believe God wants us to go back home. And it all began. And then, of course, right about there, at the end of the 1940s, I bet you could think of a couple things that happened with World War II and Hitler. And then May 14th, 1948, Israel gets their nation again. And they become, as Isaiah 66 says, can a nation be born at once? Can a nation be born in a day? And yet they were. May 14th, 1948, Israel declares their independence and becomes a nation. And they immediately get attacked by 6 nations from all around and win, outnumbered 100-1. It's just a flat miracle. It's great history you should look at. But you just look at over the decades how many 6.0s have increased. And there's no doubt that even with this scale, we are experiencing the birth pangs, the beginning of sorrows of all of these things within the last 100 years. And you go down the list here and you look at the rest of these: famines, pestilence in verse 11, fearful sights. You know, famines is an interesting one because in a worldwide economy, droughts don't cause famines. People do. It's weak governance that causes famines. It's people that prevent the proper circulation of the wealth and the material and the food that is there. That's what prevents people from getting what they need these days. It's there. I mean, I hope you don't have the picture like there's just literally not enough food on this planet. No, there is. It's a question of getting it to the people that need it. And of course, pestilence is an old-fashioned word for disease. I don't think we've seen any diseases lately, though, have we? No, we haven't seen any of those. Tongue in cheek. And then, interesting, it mentions fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. That's another whole subject. We could do a special topical message on this. Everything from the moon and stars to aliens, could be talked about here. And I've got some very interesting biblical thoughts on aliens we could talk about some other day. Because there are, let's just say this, there are absolutely extraterrestrials. They just happen to be called demons, okay? So we'll get into that some other time. But again, he mentions that these are things that will be talked about, will be seen, will be thought about. Even just the intensity and frequency of these things being talked about. I mean, just in my news feed in the last 2 days, I saw earthquakes in Morocco that killed more than 2,000 people. Did you see that one? That was just last night. The floods in Libya and Greece and some other place that were wiping out hundreds of thousands of residents. We obviously know of Maui and some other things. You can look at this as anecdotal, or you can get into the numbers and realize these things really are growing in intensity and frequency, and just exactly like the Lord told us they would. Now, if you're an unbeliever, you might be fearful of this. Come to Christ and experience the realization that we already know this place is going to burn. We already know this place has an end, but we don't. We have a future and a hope and a home coming. So these things shouldn't scare us as believers. They should just prepare us for what's coming. I want to go to verse 12 kind of launches into maybe the next kind of phase here. So first of all, Christ is trying to focus them on him. Look, all these signs are going to happen. This world's going to burn. His first point is, don't put your hope in the temple. It's going to be destroyed. His second point is, look, as we get towards the end, this whole world is going to have troubles. Whatever you put your hope in this world has the potential of being taken poof, tomorrow. So his opening point is, don't put your hope in these material things. Put your hope in me. Don't even put them in false Christ, but put them in me, the authentic me. Well, starting in verse 12, he kind of goes to the next thought, which is, how else can we live prepared with him being departed? Expect it. Expect to have troubles in this world, particularly from those that hate Jesus. As a believer, this needs to be expected, that we will encounter people that hate Christ, and they will oppose us. Now, please remember, as we're reading this, he is directly talking to his disciples, his Jewish disciples. But by extension, all of this absolutely applies to all those that would do these same things. He's saying to the disciples, because you love me, these things are going to happen. Well, doesn't that apply to us? Because we love him, these things will happen to us as well. So we look at starting in verse 12, and he says, but before all these things. So we've got this jumping back and forth in time. He really, in the last few verses, jumped us the whole way towards the end, right? But now he's going to kind of back up, and he's going to reset, and he's going to say, okay, but before all these things happen, in verse 12, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. That's an important phrase. In verse 13, it shall turn to you for a testimony. That word testimony, by the way, is the exact same word as martyr and witness. Exact same word, martyros. They will turn to you for a witness, to be a testimony, to be a martyr. Verse 14. So when they turn to you, in verse 14, settle it therefore in your hearts, not to meditate before what you will answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to gainsay or to resist. So that's the confidence that a believer should have, that if we are brought before any judicial authority, maybe you're brought before your boss at work, maybe you're brought actually before the town, or a trial, or a friend, or whatever it is, somebody is cross-examining you for your witness, for your testimony of Christ. The thought is, you don't have to premeditate exactly how you're going to answer. When somebody comes against you specifically because of Christ in you, he gives us that confidence to say, I will tell you what to say. I will work through you in those moments. And I tell you, that is such a comfort, because even now there's people thinking, well, I don't know if I should be a witness for Christ. I don't know how to, what if somebody comes against me? What if somebody's, what if I'm talking to somebody about Jesus and somebody comes out of the blue that knows so much more than I do? And the Lord's like, don't worry about it. I'll give you a mouth for what to say. And sometimes the best answer you could say in the moments where you don't know anything is, that's a great question. I'll get right back to you. That could be the most effective answer, because then you're not just giving them something fake. I've been guilty of that one once. I feel really bad. I can think of this exact example when I bet you I was 3 months saved, and I had that fire to go talk to people, and somebody asked me a Bible question I had no clue about. I was like, oh, well, I think it's this, and I find myself rattling on for like 3 minutes, and then I'm like, I don't know what I'm talking about. And then I had to go back and fix it. I was so guilty. I had to go back and I had to find them. This wasn't a person I saw on a regular basis. I was so guilty about that. So sometimes the best answer you can give is, that's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I'll get it for you. And then do that, and then come back to them. But in these moments, when we're cross-examined for the cause of Christ, he'll give us answers. There's one of our fellow Calvary pastors, Mike McClure, in Calvary Chapel, San Jose, California. I brought him up once or twice. The biggest fined pastor in America during the COVID era. And he talks about being brought to the witness stand And at times people asking him, where did you get, that was perfect what you said on the stand. He's like, I guess the Lord just used me, I think sometimes we give an answer, we give our answer, well, this is what Christ has done for me. And to us, it doesn't sound very powerful. Have you ever done that? You just try to talk to somebody of Christ and you're just like, it didn't really sound very good. If it's your testimony, if it's, and other people, I've told other people, like, there's somebody recently that wants to go help encourage people that are dying of cancer. And they're like, but I don't know anything from the Bible. I'm like, just take one verse. Just take one verse with you and go talk to them, and the Lord will use it. And the problem is, we so often go into these situations and we say what we have to say and we leave like, man, that wasn't very good. And the Lord uses it. And Mike McClure has had that experience so many times where he said things on the stand in court, and then people come up to him like, man, that was amazing. And he's like, okay, good. Like, I guess the Lord used it, And I just think that's so amazing. That's the way the Lord works. The words that come out end up being exactly what the Lord wanted to say. Paul, the apostle, he does that so many times in the book of Acts. He stood before Herod Agrippa. He stood before Festus and Felix and Roman governors. And where did Paul usually start? Do you remember? With his own testimony, with his own story. This is what happened to me. I was on the road to Damascus and a light shined. How is anybody going to come against Paul saying, this is what happened to me? And it's the same thing for us. You just tell your story. This is how Christ intersected with me. This is what happened. He convinced me that I was a sinner. He convinced me that he's awesome and that I need his forgiveness. And just start there. Just start there. And it's amazing what the Lord will do. And so multiple times in this section, he's saying that this is when we're called for his namesake, when we're put to account for his namesake, when we're witnessing. So don't get the impression that the Lord's just going to miraculously jump in if you, like stole a car and then have to appear before the judge. It's not, that's not the promise. The promise is if somebody criticizes you because of living for Christ, he promises to be with you in that. That's amazing. This testimony can truly have an amazing effect that you can't even see. One of the examples of this, I think, is just so amazing. And you could piece together part of the Bible with part of secular history, and you could see something really miraculous. We know from Josephus, again, today is the day of Josephus, I guess. We know from Josephus, it's Wars of the Jews, book 20. He talks about Caesar Nero. And he talks about how the first 5 years of Caesar Nero's reign was relatively calm. It was relatively unremarkable. When you look at secular history today and you read about Nero, you mostly read about his psychosis, his craziness, just out of his mind, the things that he did. But you dig deeper and you'll find it, whether secular or Roman historians, they all recorded his first 5 years were relatively calm. You know what happened after the first 5 years? He had an interaction with the Apostle Paul. Paul himself came, and Nero's personality completely changed. Completely changed. He ends up blaming the Christians for all of his troubles. He burns down Rome, blames it on the Christians. All of that happened after his encounter with the Apostle Paul. It's an amazing conversion. Here's the thing. When the gospel comes into a heart, it's going to do exactly what it did to Pharaoh's heart of old. You remember Moses coming to Pharaoh, and it says it says it in two different ways, that Pharaoh hardened his heart. In other places, it also says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. What does that mean? It's the same thing that happened to Nero. The point is, when the gospel comes in, the gospel hastens you towards the place you're going. If you're a heart that when you hear the gospel, it's like, oh, I need that. It will hasten that softening of your heart to the point where you come to Christ quicker. But when the gospel goes into the heart that's rejecting him, like Nero, like Pharaoh, when the gospel goes in, it does nothing but harden. Right? The same sun that will soften some substances will harden the clay. Right? It softens the wax, it hardens the clay. It's the same sun. It's the same gospel, but it has different effects on different people's hearts. And Nero hears the gospel and loses his mind, just like Pharaoh of old. So it's the same, and the gospel went into me, and it took a minute, but it eventually melted this wax down to where it needed to be. So it's amazing what the gospel will do. So just give what you got in the name of Christ and let it do its work. Let's go to verse 16. And ye shall be betrayed both, wow, look at that, both by parents and brethren and kinsfolk and friends. Some of you shall they cause to be put to death, and ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But then, look at verse 18, but there shall not a hair of your head perish. In your patience possess ye your souls. And we're looking at that like, you just said I'm going to die. And then he said, not a hair of my head will perish. Because he's thinking, Jesus said, fear not those that can kill your body and afterwards have no power to do anything else. And that's the same idea. The concept is, look, they may even kill you, your body, but what? But what? They have no power to take your soul. They have no power to take your salvation. What are they going to do? Get you to heaven quicker? Okay, that's the point here of these verses that seem contradictory. They shall not, but there shall not a hair of your head perish. Perish in the sense of eternal damnation. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall be saved, and not what? Perish. This is what he came to cure. The human condition of perishing in hell. And that's the idea here of how we put this all together in these verses. But what a hard thing that he's presenting to them. What he's preparing them for is, we may even be betrayed by some of our closest friends. And as he's saying this, he's thinking of exactly that one of his 12 that would betray him, coming up the very next day at the Passover meal, as Judas betrays him and walks away, throws away their friendship for 30 pieces of silver that he ends up not even keeping because he feels so guilty out of this. So as Christ is saying these things, listen, you may even be betrayed by somebody. He's even thinking of his own betrayal, but expect that it could happen. Expect that it could happen. It doesn't make it any easier, but we can expect it. We can know that, listen, if somebody isn't serving Christ, anything can happen. Anything can come out of them. So whether it's somebody that's secular, religious, friend, foe, family, any of them could turn at any. I don't want to say at any moment. Let's not live in skepticism of everybody around us, but also let's live in preparedness that if somebody close walks away, I bet a lot of us in this room have experienced somebody close walking away. It might not even be a betrayal of coming against you, but what about the betrayal of just leaving you? And Christ is saying this could happen. Be prepared for this, that this could happen. And we have a friend that will never leave us, nor forsake us. Isn't that it's such an interesting thing that in this earth, you never know where people are going to be tomorrow. But through it all, Christ continually says, I am with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. He knows we need that. Is there anybody in this room that needs that, to know that Jesus will never leave them? He'll never betray them, right? I love that comfort that he's bringing. You're my friends. I want to tell you my business. I will always be with you. I'm going to send you a comforter. I'm coming back. All of these expressions are, I'm with you. I'll never give up on you. Oh, I love it. I love it. In verse 19, to end that section, it's the reminder, in your patience possess ye your souls. He continually brings up that idea. Look, there's going to be a time involved here. There's going to be a patience. There's going to be a waiting. Be patient. Endure. Continue. And the unsaid there, I think, is it will happen. It will happen. Because in our lack of patience, we start to think, it's not going to happen. But he's saying, be patient. And it will happen. It will happen. All of these things will happen. So let's go to verse 20. Verse 20 now. And when you shall see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then know that the desolation of the city thereof is nigh, or close. Then let them which are in Judea, in the surrounding area, flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out of it. And let not them that are in the countries enter into the city. But in verse 22, verse 22, for these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written, so that means things are written in the Old Testament, shall be fulfilled. Verse 23, but woe unto them that are pregnant, and woe unto them that are nursing in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. In verse 24, I'll just read the first part there. They shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And I'll just stop there for just a second. Now, this is, in other parts of the Olivet Discourse, in Matthew and otherwise, they also speak of a future event that looks similar to this, called the abomination of desolation, that Daniel, the prophet, wrote of. This is not that event that Christ is speaking of right here. Because here, it's talking about Jerusalem being surrounded with armies in verse 20. Here, it's talking about people dying and becoming captives. So this is clearly a record of Christ talking, a direct answer to their question of when is the temple going to be destroyed? And so he's answering the question. Jerusalem will be surrounded by, it'll be Roman armies led by Titus. And so history records that at this time, there was 1.1 million Jews. It ends at 70 AD when Titus is going to do this. 1.1 million Jews are killed, and another 97,000 were taken captive into other Roman lands. It's one of the worst calamities to ever strike the Jewish people. They still commemorate it today as Nakba Day. Okay? The destruction of their second temple. What's so fascinating, and there is no coincidence, it's a God thing. What's so fascinating is the very day is the exact same day of the year that their first temple was destroyed all those years ago by the Babylonians. It's a remarkable thing. Why the Lord did that, we'll find out someday. But that's a remarkable occasion that it happened on the exact same day. But what's interesting, I think, about this is, what have I been saying this whole time? That Christ wrote these things down to prepare them and to prepare us. Part of the definition of that is that means we could take action based on the fact that he's prepared us. There's a historian, Eusebius, that recorded that many Christians in this day, when they heard of the Roman legions coming against Jerusalem, they fled to Pella. Not Petra, that's a different thing. They fled to Pella, which was east of Jerusalem. And it says, the way Eusebius records it in his history, is that they fled there by the oracles of God. Meaning that, they got this insight from God on why they should flee. I don't know that Eusebius was a believer, or he would have said they fled because Jesus Christ, their God, told them to flee. And they obeyed. And so they benefited by the fact that Christ prepared them for this. And they didn't just hear it, they believed it. And they fled. And they fled. So, when we talk about how Christ is our friend and he gives us this to prepare us, it's so we can even take action. We can prepare ourselves in mind, in body, and spirit to be ready for these things. But there's another half to that verse 24 I don't want to miss. Verse 24 continued, and it said, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So at the time that Titus wipes out Jerusalem in 70 AD, dissects the Temple Mount to get the gold out, wipes out the Jews, disperses them. They're going to come back in 90 something and wipe out more of the whole countryside and all around, kicking the Jews out of the whole land. Do you know this, right? Never to come back. They're going to be dispersed completely from the land in the late 90s. Like Roman days, 90s, okay? Not like the 1990s, like Roman days, the 90s. They get dispersed to go all around the world, and they have to try to keep their national identity, their religion, their language. They have to try to keep all of these things with no homeland. And May 14th, 1948, they come back into the land, having retained for almost 2,000 years their national identity, their religious identity, and their language got revived. You may know that they spoke Yiddish for a little while as they started to come back as a people in Europe, and then they brought Hebrew back. It's only something God could do. Can you imagine if we decided tomorrow we're going to give Manhattan back to some of the Native Americans? What? It's not going to happen, right? And that's only a couple hundred years after the bead transfer. If you remember that history, we bought it for some beads, right? That's like all we had to pay, I think. But can you imagine us giving that back to them and them, repopulating all of it? It's not going to happen. And yet that very miraculous thing happened for Israel, May 14th, 1948. But then one step further, I just want to go connect it now to what we read there in verse 24. He said that Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So once Titus wiped them all out, that's what happened. That whole area, Jerusalem, Judea, was all controlled by, trodden down by Gentiles for thousands of years. After that, the Gentiles went from the Romans to the Seleucids and Ptolemies to all kinds of people. Finally, in the 1800s, it was run by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And then in the 1900s, Ben-Gurion starts this drive to get Israel to come back. And the Balfour Decree at the end of World War II separated, partitioned the land, and gave this back to Israel. Only something God could do. But there's another step to this, because in 1967, you can look through the war. I mean, the Muslims have it in their holy books that you can only have fake peace with the infidels for up to 10 years. So in 1948, they immediately launched a war against Israel. They get beaten back. Israel outnumbered 100-1, and they still win at the hand of God. Another war. Finally, in 1967, they get attacked again, the 67 war, 73, the Yom Kippur war. Every decade, there was a new one that they came against them. 67, Israel beats them back to the extent that Israel takes Jerusalem. First time in modern history, the Jews were in charge of Jerusalem. Joe Focht from Philly, he tells this story that he was in, I don't remember the grocery store. He was in a grocery store in Philadelphia when this happened in 1967. And it was a Jewish grocery store. And they announced over the speakers that Israel had just taken the old city. And he said the whole place just started to weep because they saw this as a fulfillment of these prophecies. This is it. We are back in charge of Jerusalem. And what happened, if you don't know the history, though, is they immediately gave it to the Jordanians to control it. To try to give this third party representation to the Holy Temple Mount. And that's still the case today. To this day, the Jordanians run the Temple Mount area to try to keep the peace. So it's a very interesting situation. We're just that close to this time period of this happening, coming to a close. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Guys, we are this close to at any moment the Jews just saying, we're taking it back. I mean, every time I see a rock thrown from that Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount thrown at somebody during some holiday, I'm like, they're just tempting the Jews to go back in there and say, we're taking over again. And I know people during the original Gulf Wars, when they were launching, you remember when Saddam was launching Scud missiles, over from Iraq to Tel Aviv and Israel and everything, and there was people just praying like, oh Lord, maybe one of those could just hit the mosques there on the Temple Mountain. That would just give Israel the opportunity to go in and rebuild their temple. But that wasn't the Lord's will. That didn't happen. So we're this close. The point is, we're this close to the times of and he refers to it as the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled. There is a time. So the timeline that we just handed out to you, it reminds us that in God's economy, there's a period of time that was dedicated to Israel during the Old Testament. And now that Christ has come, he's instituted something new, the church. And his focus, he's using now the church in this 2,000-year time period to influence the world. His attention is directly on and through his church. It's no longer on Israel right now. But he's not done with Israel, according to the Daniel chapter 9 prophecy. He's got another 7-year period of time where his focus will be squarely on the Jewish nation. And that will be the 7-year tribulation. So when we read about The times of the Gentiles coming to a close, being fulfilled. That's what it's talking about. The time when the church is raptured out of here and God again works for another 7-year period of time, primarily through the nation of Israel. That time is coming. In fact, Paul to the Romans said it this way, to the Roman Christians, since we've been talking a lot about Roman soldiers. He said to the Roman Christians in chapter 11, Paul said, I don't want you, brethren, I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant or unknowing of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits. He's talking to Christians, saying, I don't want you to be prideful about the fact that you Christians have this special relationship with God right now. He's saying, I don't want you to boast yourself against Israel. Here's why. Because blindness in part has happened to Israel until the times of the Gentiles be come in. Paul is even reminding them, listen, church, don't boast yourself that you're better than Israel. You know, they're his natural children that are in rebellion. We are his adopted children that he chose to bring in. But don't boast yourself against them. He loves them. He wants them to come in. In fact, there's another 7-year period of time after the time of the Gentiles, the church age. Once that's complete, he will yet again turn his attention back to his natural children of Israel and say, come to me, come in. And they will. Many will. In fact, in the very end, at his second coming, all that are left at that very moment will be saved. Continue to read in later parts of Romans chapter 11, where he says at the end, all Israel will be saved. All those that are left in that time will come to him and be saved. So there's so much more we can do, but I gotta just finish this chapter and move on because we're starting to get a little late. So let's go to verse 25 and bring in our third and final point, which is how else do we live in light of Christ's departure? Watch for the signs. Watch for the signs of the end. And that should grow us in confidence as we see these signs. So it's verse 25. And there shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars. And upon the earth there will be distress of nations. And you might, if you're an underliner, you might want to underline this phrase, with perplexity. Because that's unique. The sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming upon the earth. It gives you the indication of, the astronomers that are like, oh, here comes the asteroid, and there's nothing they can do about it. For the powers of heaven, that's literally talking about the sun, the moon, and the stars. The powers of heaven shall be shaken, in verse 27, and then shall they see the Son of Man himself coming in the cloud with power and great glory. Do you know what, by the way, you know what this cloud is that's always referred to? That's you and me. Every time you see the Lord coming in the cloud, it's talking about, behold, like Jude says in verse 9, behold, he comes with 10,000s of his saints. That's us. That's the church coming back with him when it says the cloud that is with him. Even in Hebrews chapter 11, it says how, seeing that we are surrounded with such great a cloud of witnesses, let us run the race with endurance. The church in heaven is always seen as this cloud coming with Christ. It's a glorious picture. But there is a time jump here for these verses, 25, 26, 27 now, from the previous verses. And it's with great heavenly movement and shaking that Christ will return to earth for the second time, and every eye will see him on that day. But the phrase there in verse 25 where it says, with all of these things happening, it says that these things will be happening with perplexity. See, during this tribulation time, just immediately before Christ comes back, as the wrath of God is being poured out on the whole world, it will be in such a way that it is with perplexity. And the words literally means no way out. If you find yourself in the tribulation, having not accepted Christ and been raptured out of here, there's no way out of it at that point. You will be suffering through that 7-year tribulation. Oh, it's not hopeless. Oh, you could still receive Christ in the tribulation, but you'll probably lose your life to do it. It's not going to be very comfortable. So this tribulation judgment, please remember this too. I don't have time to go into the whole tribulation right now, but just a couple of quick notes on that 7-year tribulation. The tribulation is the wrath of God on unbelievers, and it is the time to prepare all Israel to be saved. That's what it's for. Our wrath, the wrath of God on our sin has already been forgiven at the cross. And those that have not accepted the cross, his wrath will be poured out in the tribulation. And that time period is then to prepare Israel to accept him at the end of the tribulation. Now, verse 28, as we go on, and he says, when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your head, for your redemption draws nigh. So these things of verse 25, 26, 27, when they begin to come to pass, be ready. Be ready. You know, as you see the people start to put up the Christmas decorations in the stores and things like that, you know that Thanksgiving is any day now. It's kind of the same way. You know, when you see the signs of the end and the things that are going to happen, know that if the signs of his second coming are popping out, then our rapture is imminent. It's imminent. It's going to happen any moment. Verse 29, he speaks something they didn't ask about. In verse 29, he spoke to them a parable, an earthly example making a heavenly principle, right? And this is the parable in verse 29. Behold a fig tree and all of the trees. When they now shoot forth, you see and know of your own selves that summer is nigh at hand. And it starts to bud, then you know summer's close. Okay, verse 31. So likewise, ye, when you see these things, what things? The things he just spoke about in verse 25 through 27. When you see these things come to pass, know that the kingdom of God is at hand. In verse 32, truly or verily I say unto you, this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. We'll get into a much fuller discussion of this in 1 Thessalonians in a few weeks. But the fig tree in Scripture always represents Israel's national privileges. So the fig tree is speaking of Israel as a nation. Not their spiritual privileges, not their religious privileges, but them as a nation. So that's very important to the interpretation of, well, what is this fig tree? And so when he gets down to saying that this generation will not pass away, he's talking about the nation of Israel will not pass away. Remember, he's speaking these things to his disciples, where he's telling the disciples, this temple is going to be destroyed, and armies are coming, and things are getting wiped out. And now he's giving them this glimmer of hope to say, wait, but I want to tell you, the nation of Israel will not be destroyed until all of these things be fulfilled, until my coming. And so that comfort to say, okay, well, we may go through destruction. We may even go through bondage and all of these things, but he won't put an end to us. And a believer of the Scripture all through the years would have known that. I have such admiration for, again, Israel didn't come back until 1948, right? The movement to come back didn't even start until 1900 under David Ben-Gurion. I have such admiration for people that wrote in the 1800s as they're reading their Bible, and they're writing things like, I don't know how this is going to happen unless Israel, I don't know, becomes a nation again or something like that. You know, and they wrote these things in the 1800s, and you're like, man, you are listening to the Lord to realize that that is the only way that some of these things could be fulfilled, is if they become a nation again. You just have such, go read those authors, because they're connected to the Lord to be able to come up with that insight. So, the rebirth of Israel, it deserves an entire study. And we'll get to that more as things go on. But it is God's super sign that we are in the end days, since they came back in 1948. I highly recommend to you a video by Dave Hunt. Dave Hunt used to run a ministry called the Berean Call. He went to be with the Lord just a few years ago. But he has a video called Israel, Islam, and Armageddon. That's the title of it. I highly recommend it because it's this wonderful short video describing the rebirth of Israel and all of the events that led up to the rebirth of Israel, with lots of old war footage and stuff. It's only about an hour long, and it's just super, super. It gives that whole history from David Ben-Gurion to 1948 to the 67 war and all of it. It's just wonderful. So he's giving them this comfort of saying, you will come back into the land again. This generation, the people of Israel, will not pass away until all of these things happen that I've spoken of. And so, I'm going to bypass a couple of things here, but all of these things of Israel coming back into the land have been prophesied. Ezekiel 36 and 37 talk about Israel becoming fruitful again in the land. Mark Twain wrote a book in the 1800s called The Innocents Abroad. He took a trip to Israel, and he wrote about how when he went to Israel, it was so desolate that not even a goat could find something to eat. There's nothing going on, completely barren. And then the prophecies of Ezekiel 37 and 38 in the early 1900s, the land becomes fruitful again. And today, Israel is the third largest exporter of fruit to Europe. The land is blooming in accordance with all of these promises that God has laid out. And the people are back in the land, and it is all happening in the last 100 years, that these things are happening in the land and for the people. So we'll leave it there for now so we can finish this chapter. So much more we could talk about. So finally, verse 34, the last point here is to live in expectation of Christ's soon return. This is part of what he wants, to live in that hope and excitement and expectation of his coming. And that's how he ends this dialogue that he wanted to give them. In verse 34, he says to them, so take heed to yourselves. Based on all these things I just told you, take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your heart be overcharged with surfeiting. Does anybody have another translation on that? He doesn't want us to be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness. Does anybody have anything there? It's kind of the idea of partying and partying, and it really comes from the word hangover.
Lollygag.
Okay, lollygag. Yep. Partying is a good. What is it? Carousing. That carries the insinuation of illicit adult activities involved with your partying and carousing. Absolutely. This is the idea. It's a very difficult word to translate. Surfeiting. Don't get caught up in all of the sensual junk that's out there, is what he's saying. And the word overcharged is even the word burdened. Don't get yourself burdened with all of these partyings and drunkenness. And then he says, and additional to partying and drunkenness, the cares of this life. Don't get overburdened with those things. And so that day would come upon you unaware. We can get so tied up to the things of this earth that we're so spiritually dull to what the Lord's doing around us. How many people in the days of Noah must have been like that? Like just doing their thing. And then they look at this boat and they're like, that guy's nuts. And they don't give it a second thought. Right? And they're just doing their thing and they're having fun. And that's the way the days of Noah was described. And the Lord's challenging us. Don't be like that. Don't be so focused on the fun of this world that you miss it, that you see the seriousness of what's happening. There are two things that can take our heart away from knowing and believing the Lord. Trials and tribulations can do that for some people. Trials come into their life and they're like, I don't want anything to do with the Lord. He's not helping me, which is wrong, but some people have that happen. But there is another equal thing that tears many people away from the Lord, which is the good things of life. The expression here, the cares of this life, is an expression of the good things of life. In the parable of the sower and the seed, the trials and tribulations of this world were pictured as the stones on the path that didn't allow the word of God to go in. But also in that parable of the sower and the seed, the thorns were a picture of the cares and pleasures and good things of this life. And both of them were holding people back from the simplicity of receiving the gospel and living for him. And so that's the caution the Lord gives right here. Don't get so caught up in the fun things of this world that you lose focus on the things that matter, that are big in this world. Don't dull our senses with all the drunkenness that this world offers. What a picture, though, of what this world offers, that you can get drunk with it. You know anybody that's gotten drunk with video games, so to say?
People are getting drunk with the new casino
Yep.
Shippensburg.
Yep. You can get drunk with gambling in casinos. You can get drunk with a lot of habits.
There's a sign right down the road from here.
Absolutely. All of these addictions you can get drunk with them, and then you're not focused any longer on the things of Christ, where we're headed for eternity. We go to verse 35, and we're trying to finish this off. Verse 35, for as a snare shall come upon all of them. He calls the good things of this life a snare. They can snare you and trap you. The snare will come upon all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. So therefore, this is what we do in verse 36. Watch ye therefore, and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to be worthy to stand before the Son of Man. So this wrath that he's describing, it will come upon the whole world, but not on us. Not on us as believers. We've said that as believers, we have had our wrath removed at the cross. Since we're out of time, I don't want to turn there now, but you really should look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And again, we'll be there in just a couple of months. But 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, the whole chapter describes this very thing, about how we've had our wrath removed, but the unbelievers will have their wrath given out to them during this tribulation. We'll be raptured out of here. We will escape the wrath to come. And we'll do a complete study on the rapture when we get to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, by the way. But whatever your view of the end times is, the one absolute necessity, and as he's pointing out in these verses, is that we have got to live in an imminency that he could come at any moment. That is one of the fundamental baseline assumptions to the whole thing. He wants us to live prepared, that it could happen like that. It could happen at any moment. So we need to live that way. Be prepared. Have that hope stirring in us at all times. And then finally, verse 37. And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, and at night he went out and he abode in the mount that is called the Mount of Olives. And all the people came early in the morning to him in the temple to hear him. And so just that refreshment that he would have gotten to go back and be with, I really want their last name so I can stop calling them Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, but their house. MML. Can't even use the initials. So yeah, he went to their house every night, just refreshed with them. What a joy that would have been. So I hope you see throughout this whole course that although he's got this super important mission, he still takes time for them to say, let me prepare you. Let me help you. I'm never going to leave you without that comfort and that hope. So it's just such an encouragement. So let's utilize what he's given to us. Let's live focused on Christ. Don't get so caught up on the materialism of this world, and whether it's commercial materialism or religious materialism. Don't get caught up on any of that, but stay focused on who he is. We don't come here to worship a building, a process, or anything else. We come here to worship a person. A person. Jesus. That's what we're here for. And I hope that's why you're here. Nothing else is worth spending our life into. But we also, number two, need to expect that we will have troubles in this world as the days go on. But Jesus said in John 16, but be of good cheer because I have overcome the world. And that is the silver lining to it all. And then third, he says to watch for the signs of the end. And that should allow us to grow in confidence that what he said is really going to happen. These things really are coming true. We are living in the last days. Of all people, we are the people that have seen Israel come back into the land in 1948. There's a nation with Jewish people in it called Israel. Boy, if you study nothing else about prophecy, get a grasp on how amazing, how supernatural that is, that there is this people living in their land again after almost 2,000 years. We are in that generation. And then finally, live with expectation that he's coming again soon. I want my first step towards Jesus when I see him to be so natural. I don't want to be like Lot's wife, like, oh, I could really, wait, hang on, Jesus, I need to get my, And no, I want to be like, he's here, just start going. I don't care what's behind me. I just want to go. just hold on so loosely to the things of this world that the moment he shows up, you're just like, I'm out of here. I want him. I want him. Oh, I hope that thrills your heart. And just the joy of knowing that he's prepared us for what we're going to face in the meantime. Amen. Let's close.